Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us today, which is one of the most important days for our oceans and one of the most important days for Plastic Oceans Australasia. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by three guests who are working towards protecting the oceans in very different ways and at very different times in their careers. They are a youth ambassador for our oceans, a scientist with a long career in this area, and an entrepreneur who is not only helping with the oceans through his products, but also with education and advocacy. As most of you will know, this year's theme of World Oceans Day is One Ocean, One Climate, One Future Together. These three guests come together in a unique way to show that we can all protect our oceans, and by learning about the impacts, make better choices to protect our future generations. I'd like to introduce our guests in order of speaking. Our first guest is Nicola Scholas, who's a member of the World Oceans Day Advisory Council and co-host of the Green Style podcast. Welcome, Nicola.
Thanks, Ricki, for having me.
Next, I'd like to welcome David Booth, who's Professor of Marine Ecology at the University of Technology in Sydney. Hello, David.
Hi, Ricki. Hi, everybody.
And finally, we have all the way from the UK, Adam Costello. He is the owner of Inland Sea, a company that educates people on the impacts to oceans and makes clothing out of seaweed. Good morning, Adam, and thank you so much for being awake for us in the middle of the night. I believe it's 3 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah, it's definitely the latest I've ever been up for this type of thing, for sure.
Thank you.
It's all good.
Thank you all for being here today. So, of course, I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to the elders past and present. I extend that respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people here today. As mentioned, we'll have a Q&A towards the end of the event. Please feel free to pop your questions into the chat as we're proceeding, and we'll do our best to answer those. And also, as mentioned, we will be having a recording of this, which will be sent out to you in an email. So a little history on today. World Oceans Day began in 1992 to raise awareness on the human impacts to our oceans. But it wasn't actually until 2008 that it was officially recognised by the United Nations. Did you know that the ocean covers over 72% of the Earth's surface? And every third breath that we breathe is thanks to our oceans. Not many people know that. So as we are all part of the global ocean, with the Pacific Ocean being the largest and the deepest of them all, covering a whopping 46%, we feel here in Australia that we have more to do with the care factor, probably, than the rest of the world. So for those of you that aren't familiar with us, Plastic Oceans Australasia, we are a not-for-profit, part of a global alliance, with a mission to change people's attitude towards plastic within a generation. So we do that mainly through our science and research, which underpins our education, school and business programs. We run many events like this to help raise awareness about the importance of our oceans. And this year in particular, the United Nations Decade of Oceans is beginning, and it's a focus on ocean science and sustainable development, with events like this one today focusing to protect at least 30% of the ocean by 2030. Our first guest is going to talk a little bit more about that and what it means to her. So I'd now like to introduce Nicola, who is a member of the World Oceans Day Youth Advisory Council. She also is co-host of the Green Style podcast, and a podcast, I believe, that talks about sustainable fashion in Australia and New Zealand. Nicola, I understand you're currently studying a Bachelor of Marine Science at Deakin University, and Nicola joins us now. Welcome, Nicola. I'd like to know a little bit more about your position and what you're doing on the World Oceans Day Youth Advisory Council. What is it and how did you get started?
Yes, Ricki, thanks so much for having me firstly, and happy World Oceans Day, everyone. So being a part of the World Oceans Day Youth Advisory Council has not only opened up so many doors for me, but has given me the opportunity to meet and work with some incredible people globally. The World Oceans Day Youth Advisory Council is excuse me, an opportunity to connect and unite us youth and others around our blue planet. The aim's really about taking action on healthier ocean and a more sustainable and responsible society. The 16 to 25-year-old representatives are from all around the world, from Mexico to Nigeria to Cameroon and Sweden to me in Oz and my friend in New Zealand. This diversity really allows for a holistic understanding of the world, and I believe without connecting with others from around the globe, the action would be less successful. Youth really are the future, and I've met some absolutely amazing people who are doing the unthinkable in their own unique way. I've made some lifelong friends, and one of which I co-host a podcast with. So I guess the experience in that sense is really incredible, being surrounded by youth who are so passionate about the ocean and all that surrounds it is an environment in which I personally thrive. And I really believe that these sorts of environments need to keep multiplying in this space because it's important for the entire equation.
Amazing. What a fantastic opportunity for you. It's and it's so important that there's a global effort to help with tackling, the plastic issue in particular, because it's one of the main impacts on our oceans, and obviously youth, and it's all about the generational change, and we talk about that all the time in our organisation. So can you tell me about the podcast? Sounds really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Green Style podcast is basically myself and two other incredible young women from Australia and New Zealand. Maha Fia, who's from New Zealand, who I actually met at World Oceans Day, the Youth Advisory Council. We created this podcast for World Oceans Day about a year ago. So today's pretty incredible for us. It has a lot of meaning. And since then, we've added another crew member who's also one of my best friends, Lucy Roth. And I guess the reason we wanted to create this podcast was because we personally are quite passionate about fashion and our ocean and planet. And in our areas, these issues around fashion and around clothing weren't really understood, and how our clothing was being made and where it was being made and at what cost just wasn't understood. And we believe that this was really important to, I guess, discuss and educate with our audiences. We thought, what a better way to discuss how our environment and our ocean and people are ingrained in the fashion industry, to actually interview those who are doing incredible things. Those who are innovators in sustainable and ethical fashion, and those who are local and not giant conglomerate businesses, because we started this podcast in the middle of lockdown as well. So it was really important to showcase local businesses and how great of things that they're doing. One of the first interviews we actually did was with a sustainable and ethical fashion, I guess you could call her innovator or icon, Claire Press, who also hosts a podcast called The Wardrobe Crisis. She's incredible and a true inspiration to many fashion designers as well. So we've learned so much about from her and through the podcast. And we don't have a massive studio and no major filming gear. We use all of our recordings through Zoom, which is, has its ups and downs, but our passion really what drives this podcast and our wanting to educate people. And we are slowly investing in, getting some better equipment. Maybe a microphone would be great. But it's all about connecting and sharing and educating to so many people, because it's a very personal issue.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I think you're getting your voice out there, so that's fantastic. You're doing a great job with that part of it. But you're only at the beginning of your career. You've got so much that you're working on, and you're studying marine science, so you're obviously invested in protecting the environment. Just to, finish off, I guess, with on that note about young people and investing time and what people are doing. Can you share a message? What would be your one message, takeaway message for young people out there of how and what they could do to help with the ocean on it, like today? If they wanted to go out and do something today, what would the message be?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess I'll just kind of divert a little bit. I guess I'll talk a bit about my sort of insights and reasoning into why I'm basically dedicating my life to the ocean, because there was a few pivotal moments for me that really sort of shaped my aspirations. So when I was younger, about 6 or 7, sort of before you begin to appreciate things in life, I was on a holiday in northern Queensland, which is just beautiful along the Great Barrier Reef. And I had my tiny little snorkel set. I've actually got a prop here of that, and I saw a green sea turtle pop out from the water, and after that I was totally obsessed. For me, yeah, I knew from then on that I wanted to spend the rest of my life working within the ocean and learning and being a part of the ocean, and studying marine science for me was what I knew I had to do and always wanted to do. I would say for youth and for people who are just wanting to get involved, I would say get involved. Don't doubt yourself or your capabilities. No matter your age, it's never too late or too early. And just because you don't have a degree in marine science or oceanography doesn't mean you can't get involved. Right now, to take away, I would say look for local environmental groups or Facebook pages, or filtering some sort of social media that you may have to find possible opportunities. If you are at university, I would recommend speaking to your lecturers and asking if there's any volunteering opportunities to just get out in the field, as well as do your research. Look through organisations and look through reputable sources and ask yourself, are these the organisations that really align with your values? There are so many welcoming and beautiful people out there, and so many welcoming groups, and not to be scared to put yourself out there. Volunteering your time, you really learn so much about yourself, and not only about the ocean, but how you personally work best and connect with people. And you are unique, and whatever you bring to the table, make sure it's authentically you and follow that you're passionate about, because in my opinion, at least, I feel like passion's the most important thing. And sometimes it does get really overwhelming and hard, and just because you're learning so much and you're being educated about what's going on around the world, it can get really, really full on, and you can feel lost. So knowing that there is good things going on, great people out there, and you're one of them, so just go for it.
Well, that's great advice for everyone out there, and it resonates with what we do with our programs, of course, because we do that with the schools and businesses to help them eliminate their plastic with self-led actions. And we actually have some people here today that are listening that are currently participating in their epic Plastic Oceans journey with us. So as you said, it's never too late to start at any time. And it's really inspiring, the work you're doing, and what you're doing with your Sustainable Fashion podcast will resonate, I know, with our third guest, Adam, so I'm sure he'll add value to that when we get there. So thank you so much. And I know that there'll be some questions in the chat for you, I'm sure, as we continue on. So next, I'd like to welcome David Booth. David is the Professor of Marine Ecology at the University of Technology in Sydney and is the ex-president of the Australian Coral Reef Society. He has published a mere 160 plus papers on climate change and other impacts on fish and fisheries. And today I know David's joining us to tell us some of the major impacts on our oceans, as well as how we can be involved in citizen science projects. Welcome, David, and it's wonderful to see you again. Seems like a long time ago, only a year ago though, when we were doing a virtual dive in Sydney Harbour. So following from what Nicola was saying, is there a project you're involved with that you would like to share with our guests about helping marine species?
First, thanks very much, Ricki. And yes, happy World Oceans Day. It's an exciting day for us ocean scientists to get that sort of profile. It was great hearing Nicola and to hear someone who's transcending fashion and marine science. And interestingly, I have a student who is also in that realm. He's a very famous jewellery designer who's come and starting to learn marine biology. The other day, I had the pleasure of, uniquely for me, going to a fashion event at World Fashion Week, whereby he and his filmmaker friend had made a small film on our seahorses, which they played while a very well-known designer of sustainable clothing did their thing. It was me out of a fish out of water, but it was very interesting to see. And I think it's going to be very important to transcend the different areas, and that science should not be sort of hidden away. But yeah, so there's lots I can talk about, but I thought I'd just first of all say something to celebrate the ocean. Now, we're very lucky in Sydney and on the East Coast and all around Australia in having a really wonderful ocean. There are problems which you can talk about, but there's also, you need to celebrate it. And in Sydney, where I'm sitting at the moment, for instance, there's been over 600 fish species recorded in Sydney Harbour, 3 times as many as the whole of Great Britain. So, you know, we've got something to be proud of. There's kelp forests. We have sea dragons that we work on. We have seahorses. We have sharks. We have all sorts of amazing things that we need to look after. It's definitely not too late. So, yeah, so as far as what sort of projects that people can get interested in, well, one I was going to mention was, because we work on these amazing sea dragon creatures, unique to Australia, we have a website called Sea Dragon Search, which people could look at, and it's a way to connect with all those divers and snorkelers all around Australia who love taking beautiful pictures. We use those pictures to recognise individual dragons and learn about their biology, and it's you know, it's got thousands and thousands of people doing it already. So that's just one of the things. We can also talk about our white seahorse research, where this is a newly endangered seahorse, unique to the east coast of Australia. There's only 2 seahorses in the world that are endangered, the other one's in South Africa. And so we're engaged in a project, and which is really ramping up now, where we're using Sea Life Aquarium to rear baby seahorses, which we tag and put back into the wild in Sydney Harbour and other places. And this is getting real traction. People love seahorses, it turns out. In fact, my student was on Romper Room this morning telling them all about it. And so that project really engages everybody to rehabilitate the habitat and the seahorses themselves. And the other big one, which we have a little film on, I think you'll be able to link to, is on our Sydney Opera House Reef project, and that's enhancing the habitat next to the Opera House. And it turns out the Opera House, of course, is a world icon, so this project's got global interest, and the Opera House has been a fantastic partner.
Yeah, it's amazing, absolutely amazing. I think you even mentioned to me in the past about the you know, you're building little seahorse hotels. Which and obviously people love that, like, you know, gets the traction, as you said. So I'm sure that we'll share that in the chat about those different links with what you've told us. Could you tell us some more about some of the human-caused issues that we're facing in Australia with some of the species that you're talking about?
Well, of course, yeah, the big one on everyone's radar, I think most people would realise that climate change is a huge issue. And Eastern Australia, it turns out, is, if I can use the pun, a hotspot for climate change. The good old East Australian current, Nemo current, is bringing tropical fish and actually corals down. We've been watching this for 20 years, which is very exciting for us who work on these, but also at the expense of the local habitats, seagrasses and kelps and things like that, which are on the decline here. And they have a wonderful selection of not only species we love to look at, but ones we love to eat, abalone and lobster and things. So there's a real industry issue with climate change in this part of the world. And so that's a big one. But of course, we've also got other things as well, including local pollution, especially Sydney, which is an urban harbour, which is in pretty good shape in many ways, but really needs looking after. That sediment is toxic and we have to not disturb that. So there's all these issues. Fishing, plastics is a huge one. And we snorkel a lot around Sydney surveying, and all we see is fishing line wrapped around our seahorse hotels, lures, just a huge amount of plastic, and also bottles and things like that really do disturb marine life.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't realise how, you know, that there is obviously, that there are a number of species I know that are, you know, seriously on the decline. Is there anything that we could do with those in particular, you know, to help? And you've talked about seagrass and kelp in New South Wales, and they're obviously important feeding habitats. So I wonder if there's things that we can do there to help. If there was one thing as a takeaway you could mention to our guests.
Well, there's all sorts of local things, and we should not be afraid to act locally, whether it's cleaning up plastics, not using plastics, lobbying against new developments on the ocean. But honestly, things like climate change, it's a very tough problem, and we're not going to solve it by popping out new corals or whatever. That's not going to fully solve the problem. And unfortunately, it is talking to your politician and being active locally. Is anyone in Scott Morrison's electorate? Please talk. And there really is, and of course, scientists aren't really adept at talking about politics, but those of us on the front line realise it's not just the science is in. We don't need more interest and information from scientists. We know what's happening. We just need some action.
Mm. So I wondered if you would expand just a little bit on tropicalisation, which is, for some of us out there, we might know what that is. Just expand on that as well, which I think would be really helpful.
Well, tropicalisation is a fairly new term, but it really reflects what's happening in not only our oceans, but also the land. That is the poleward movement of tropical species. Now, in our case, it's the Nemo phenomenon, I guess you'd call it, where tropical fish, and recently we've discovered actually quite beautiful tropical corals off Sydney, and they are bringing in more fish species we hadn't seen before. This is the good news. The bad news is some of those species, plus a very insidious one, a tropical sea urchin, are chomping away on seagrass and kelp and are tropicalising our coasts. And so what that means is the species that used to live here are disappearing. And in Tasmania, for instance, indirectly the lobster industry has removed some of the larger lobsters, which used to be able to control the urchins. Without them, the kelp is being eaten away. And so all those habitats are being lost. So this is quite an insidious thing that's going to, I think, rapidly multiply in the next decade.
So lots of work to do, obviously, a huge amount of work to do. And I'm sure many people that are listening wouldn't realise, how, as I said, how important it is. But I also know that it also affects our bird species as well. So it's not just what's below the water, it's also what's above the water. So, and I suppose, there's lots more opportunities to learn more about that. And I think that there'll be a few questions in the chat on this for you, and we can follow up with that at the end of the session. But I think it really segues very well into introducing our third guest. So we'll go on to speak with our final guest, Adam Costello, and we'll come back to questions, David, later. So Adam is the owner of Inland Sea, a company that makes clothing out of seaweed fibre. Segues really well from what David's talking about. So the company not only makes great clothing, but it shares the important message that we need to protect oceans all over the world, from climate change to offsetting carbon, while investing, I believe, in seaweed farms in the UK as well. So welcome, Adam. And please, could you tell us a bit more about yourself and your company, Inland Sea?
Sure, yeah. First of all, thank you so much for having me on, Ricki and Morgan, and happy World Oceans Day today. So Inland Sea, I set it up in 2017, initially to raise awareness about plastic pollution, litter in our cities, and just how that ultimately ends up in the sea. At that time, if anyone can sort of cast their mind back 4 years, it was kind of before Greta Thunberg, it was before even Extinction Rebellion. I think they were just coming to surface, but no one was making any t-shirts out of recycled plastic bottles at that time. I went to a Patagonia event and basically learned how you could actually find a company to make t-shirts out of recycled plastic and recycled polyesters, and I knew that was something that I needed to do if I was going to start a t-shirt company, which is what I wanted to do at the time. So I was put in contact with a company in America who then I placed an order to make my first t-shirts out of 50% organic cotton and 50% recycled plastic bottles. So I definitely wasn't like the first company to do it like in the UK, but I was definitely one of the first independents, and it just allowed me to kind of learn and just plant the seed. I remember selling the t-shirts at the local market where I live in the town called Macclesfield, and people just couldn't believe that it was made out of recycled plastic bottles. But now, obviously, they're everywhere. So many companies do this now, which is really great. But at the end of the day, we're still using plastic, we're still using polyester, we're still getting all those microfibers and little tiny balls that everyone knows about are ending up in the sea, and that is obviously a huge problem for plastic. So along the way of me running this very tiny, small, independent operation, I ran a podcast with my partner Vic. So we came up with an idea called a podcast called Things Can Only Get Greta, which is a podcast. We tried to do just a general one about the climate crisis. And it was through this podcast that I got a gentleman on called Alec Watt, who at the time was really the only person that seemed to know very much about seaweed and seaweed farming in the UK. It's a very, very emerging industry in the UK. I know it's a lot bigger in Australia, but it was through that podcast we got on the podcast, and he taught us absolutely tons about seaweed and all the incredible benefits that it can have for the climate crisis and all the solutions. And it was during that podcast that I learned that you can actually create a fibre from seaweed and then blend it with other materials to create t-shirts. So it was a complete light bulb moment at that time. So I knew that I had to go about doing this. It was through my other podcast, which is called the Ethical Pages podcast, which is a bit more of a general podcast interviewing ethical business owners, essentially. And it was actually through that podcast that I learned where I could get these t-shirts made using seaweed. So my advice to students or anyone out there who wants to get into creating like a good ethical business, I suppose, is maybe set up your own podcast and interview people that that you're really interested in. It's a really good way of connecting up with people. So yeah, it's through that podcast I learned how to. I got the contact for the factory in Lithuania, which is the only factory in the world actually that's accredited by Greenpeace. So you couldn't get a more kind of ethical, green, environmentally friendly factory to make the clothing. So this was in January of this year during the pandemic, and obviously I'm a tiny independent, I'm just entrepreneur on my own really, and obviously money is a really difficult thing. I didn't have the upfront funds to fund a minimum order with a factory, so I went about using Kickstarter to crowdfund the money in January. So I launched that I think it was the 21st of January. It lasted 30 days and we managed to raise just over £14,000. So we went quite over our target, which was absolutely amazing. And it was just during that whole entire period of me intensely of having to promote it and get as many people on board that I learn absolutely loads more about seaweed and all the absolutely incredible benefits and uses that seaweed can do. And yeah, so these aren't the actual real t-shirts, but I've brought some of the older t-shirts on just to show you. Yeah, I've actually had the samples of the t-shirts with the seaweed fibre, and they're almost like a silky, really soft feel to them. And they've got loads of benefits in wearing them as well, and obviously health benefits. It's like you could choose between wearing something that's got polyester in it, which is obviously plastic, which is known to be carcinogenic, or you could choose to wear a t-shirt that has seaweed in it, which releases loads of vitamins and minerals, which are really good for your skin. So that's what I'm trying to push to influence other bigger companies and people to raise the awareness of seaweed and how it can be used to basically completely revolutionize the fashion industry.
Wow, amazing. Well, I'm looking forward to receiving a t-shirt.
Yeah, of course.
But I think there's also, you mentioned something when we chatted in the past about diabetes. I think that there was health benefits with seaweed clothing. Could you mention a little bit about that if you could?
Sure, yeah. So it was actually through the gentleman that we first learned about seaweed called Alec Watt. He has diabetes. I'm sure he doesn't mind me saying that. But he knew that eating seaweed was really good for that condition, and he also found socks that you can wear that emit the benefits of the seaweed through your actual body. So that's how I learned that actually wearing it can actually help. It's not only really nice and good on your skin, it can actually help conditions like diabetes, and obviously eating it as well is really, really good for you.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, I love seaweed. Yeah. Anyway, I think it's a really undervalued resource, but it's
Yeah.
obviously getting the airtime now, and it's fabulous to hear about the fact that you've found doing podcasts like what Nicola was saying earlier on, that podcast has been a really fantastic way for both of you to really get your messaging out there and really to be able to get, speak to people and widely, as well as bringing on your own guests to chat with them and gather all this knowledge. So obviously you're very keen on advocacy, educating people about the impacts, human impacts on the oceans and what's happening within. I was curious about how the name Inland Sea came about, and why that is so important to you.
I've actually this evening, because I've been obviously had to stay up till 3 o'clock in the morning, I've rewritten my Inland Sea mission statement and the About Me page for the website. So I'm well practiced at this question. So how did you know? Yeah. So it's actually there's a place on Anglesey, which is where I went on holiday when I was a kid, and my family live there now and things, like in Wales. So it's a small stretch of sea in between something called the Holy Island and Anglesey, which is actually called the Inland Sea, or we called it the Inland Sea. So there was that name. And then I actually, because I live inland, I class myself as, I'm a surfer, but I class myself as what they call an inlander. So I'm an inland surfer basically. So it's kind of got two meanings. And then a lot of it felt right with actual climate, with the climate crisis focus as well, with the Inland Sea, and our strapline as well is born in the city, thrown in the sea, which is kind of almost about me being born inland and then thrown in the sea, but also we kick it back to actual plastic and pollution of a lot of the pollution being born in the city and then thrown in the sea. So yeah, that's how the name came about.
Fantastic connection. So I guess finally, before we go over to the Q&A, I'm very curious about this because you mentioned about being a surfer, and I love being in the water and scuba diving and snorkeling, etc. And obviously, a lot of us wear wetsuits. And we all know that wetsuits are made of neoprene, and neoprene is not something that can be recycled easily, if at all. It's very, very difficult to do that. And I understand that you've got a bit of a project going for people to donate old wetsuits to. And I wondered if you could just, just expand briefly on that, and then we'll have to go on to our group Q&A.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, it's just we try to do as many kind of community-led projects as possible, probably 3 or 4 a year. But one of the ones that we've done is basically collecting as many old wetsuits as we possibly can, which we had an amazing response to as soon as we launched it. I couldn't quite believe how many people just had wetsuits lying around and just obviously just donated them. But yeah, we basically want as many old wetsuits as possible because they can't be recycled in any way. I know the company Finisterre, UK company here, have tried to recycle them, but I don't think they succeeded. So it's effectively a material that will end up in landfill, and it's very toxic. It's obviously oil-based. So we are upcycling wetsuits into new products like laptop cases, sunglass cases, little key holders and things like that. But at the end of the day, anyone can do that. So kind of inspire people in Australia. I'm sure there are people doing it in Australia, but just to basically try to keep wetsuits out of landfill. I know in the UK, wetsuit sales have gone really big in this last through the pandemic, because loads of people have been going wild swimming because the swimming pools have been shut. So we'll have a load of wetsuits, I reckon, in the coming years. But yeah, just it seems a very obvious project. So hopefully that inspires people to do the same.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I know there'll be a few questions on that, and what I'll do now, I know that we've got quite a few questions that have been coming through, so we'll attempt to get all those questions answered. So what I'll do now is I'll pass over to Morgan, and we'll start to get those questions answered for everybody. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Cheers.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ricki. So Nicola and David will just come back now with their cameras on, and we'll start the Q&A session. And we're getting some really great questions through the chat at the moment. So if you do have any more, please feel free to put your chat into the chat function. Now, the first one is from Fiona, and this goes to Adam and Nicola about sustainable fashion. And it's about the cost of eco-fashion and why it's so expensive. And maybe, Adam, you can also talk about some of the challenges with doing good with your fashion, but yet, you know, the prices or availability of certain materials and those challenges. So maybe we'll start with you, Adam, just about some of those challenges, and then we'll go to Nicola about the importance of eco-fashion.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, the biggest challenge is actually recycling the old clothing. It's actually really difficult and actually uses more energy and more money effectively to actually recycle that material. So if you've got an old t-shirt or jeans or all the different types of clothes that basically you want to chuck out, you think that it could be quite easily recycled, but it's super difficult. It has to be cut up, and all the different materials that they're made out of, yeah, you'd have to blend. So it is super hard, and that's a major problem. And this is where I see seaweed being a huge solution, or not just seaweed. There's different materials that can biodegrade, but if we can somehow use seaweed to replace polyester, there's a good chance of being able to do that. So there's a chance of either, if the clothes can't be recycled, at least we know that they'll definitely biodegrade. So yeah, that's why it's so expensive, because it's just very difficult to actually recycle the clothing.
Absolutely. And now, Nicola, do you want to tell us about why it is really important to the future, and especially as a younger panelist here today, about your future in the ocean as well, and why, even though it costs a bit more, eco-fashion in Australia and New Zealand, which is your focus in the podcast, is so important that we make the right choices with our purchases?
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the things that we do discuss a lot on the podcast, and just within each other, that there is a huge, there's a huge difference between, usually fast fashion labels that are selling their products at a cheap price, and when you really look into that, you have to understand the reasoning behind that. There's a lot of reasoning, actually, because they're made in massive factories, and the workers themselves are not being paid living wages. There's a difference between a minimum wage and a living wage, and a living wage gives these people access to properly living, basically having access to savings, having access to properly pay rent, instead of just day-to-day surviving on what they can. So yeah, obviously, with being a more ethical and responsible, sustainable is a very touchy word, because what is really sustainable, but being more responsible business, using resources that are at a higher quality, because they do cost more, and they cost more because they take more time and more money to produce, but also because the workers are being paid properly, and there's access to fire exits, and yeah, so the best thing that the thing that we talk about a lot is more like shopping your own wardrobe, because it's not easy to find a sustainable and ethical business or responsible business and be like, yeah, this is exactly where I'm going to put all my money into. I'm going to shop everything from there. We just don't have, not a lot of us have the ability to do that. So maybe if you can, and if you want to, investing in these sorts of businesses, but it's important to look what you already have, or find thrift stores, for example, that you can get into.
Perfect. Thank you, Nicola. And I might just jump to the next question, which is also about sustainable fashion, and then we'll go into some science questions for David.
Because I actually have a comment about sustainable fashion, if you don't mind. We all watched Craig Rooscastle's War on Waste, and we all saw the episode where they piled up all the beautiful, perfectly functional clothing that people had thrown out in one single day in Australia, not to mention the makeup with all the microplastic beads in them. There's more to it than sustainable clothing is important, but if you're throwing it away after one use or whatever, you're being unsustainable no matter what it's made from. So, you know, the whole other issue of people getting a grip, and to me as a frustrated scientist, and just seeing this incredible waste in the fashion industry, sadly, for no great gain. So, you know, it is a concern, and I think it needs to be addressed.
Thank you, David. And that consumption, you know, a society of consumption, whether it's single-use plastic items with your food or it's your clothing with fast fashion, there's a couple of behaviour changes that, you know, in the current society we need to address. But I might just jump back to you, Adam. And we just were speaking about, you know, ethical brands and the factories that make the clothing. And I know within Landsea you use a specific factory that is ethical. But we've just had a question come in from Calvin also asking about, when you approach established clothing businesses and having the using of seaweed fibres in the clothing, what's the common responses that you get from those factories? And I just also wanted to include in there about your advocacy within the brand. So you approach these clothing brands, not only do you make the clothing, you know, with the seaweed fibre, but you also have a strong focus on advocacy within the brand. So I was just hoping you could include that in your answer.
Sure, yeah. So the T-shirts that we've made along the way, we've always tried to do about an actual cause and a charity. So we've tried to raise money for various charities along the way, whether that's to do with climate change or social issues. We did a T-shirt called a Guide to Great Women, which was just like a series of women, not that of just women that lots of people actually didn't know who have done just incredible things, like and that was to raise money for domestic abuse victims. We've done T-shirts, obviously, to raise awareness about plastic pollution at the very beginning, and then so the question was about the actual factories as well. Sorry. So the factory that we use is in Lithuania. So it's like I said before during the talk, it's the only factory that's accredited by Greenpeace. So we have a direct contract, I suppose, with those guys for these seaweed T-shirts. But I think it's very difficult to find the factories that will use that seaweed fibre. They're a very specialised factory who do this, and they do a lot with sustainable and new materials. I think they're doing something at the moment with orange peels as well. You can make a material out of orange peel. So yeah, that's who we use at that factory at the moment. So and yeah, I want to encourage other bigger brands. Like, it's not, I'm not just saying I want to be like the first brand or independent to use seaweed fibre. I want to lay down the tracks for bigger brands to do it and just raise the awareness, because people at the end of the day don't even realise that you can make clothing out of seaweed. So yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Adam. Now we're going to move on to some science questions. So David, we've had a lot of questions come in for you. One of them about fishing materials and then polluting the ocean. And I might combine that with another question which talks about shifting policy. And can you comment on the role of scientific research to inform the best value mitigation measures? So informing policy through science. And if it's possible, just to include in there, if you find any fishing materials when you're out diving, or if they're polluting our oceans, and also policy.
All right, I'll do a reverse answer in case I forget the last bit, if that's all right. Yeah, as I mentioned, fishing, and it's not just fishing, it's people using our oceans, especially in urban areas like Sydney and Melbourne, and the waste that's put into the local estuaries and coasts. Divers are becoming increasingly aware. There's a sort of a Facebook group in Sydney that has 3,000 or 4,000 members, and one break-off group is called Women of Water, and they have taken a particular interest in having clean-up days. Now, of course, they're cleaning up other people's mess. They didn't put the plastic there, but they're also educating the people on site, whether they be fishers or kids throwing things in. So it's small scale, but really it can make a difference. It's just frustrating to them when they go back the next week, all the junk's put back in again. So more education is needed. As far as informing policy, well, a good example of this is I've been struggling for marine protection in our state for over 30 years now, and unfortunately with limited success. Now, some of you may know, probably only about 5% of our coastline is actually protected from direct exploitation like fishing. This is not just marine parks, but within marine parks, they call them sanctuary or no-take areas. In Sydney, the Sydney region, which is, of course, where the most pressure is in our state, a proposal was put forward a few years ago through the government to bring in a few of these areas, 2%. Now, the science was done, really good science, really compulsive. There were 80% of people in surveys, sort of including fishers, agreed with it. But a couple stood up to our minister, and of course, one of the minor parties, the Shooters, Fishers and Farmers Party, said, well, you know, we're going to block this. And within an instant, in fact, I was on radio at the time with the minister on ABC. He said, oh, we've changed our mind. We think it's unsafe to put these marine parks in. It's been shelved. Millions of dollars spent on this. And so this is the frustration of scientists. It's always good to have more science, but the science is out. It's clear that these small areas can have great benefit, and they're not being done for political will. Local groups, there's some wonderful fishers, and local people are really lobbying to get this back on the menu again. But of course, the bushfires and COVID have put it back again. So it's very frustrating being a scientist and trying to get some engagement in these matters. So I'm not, you know, at the local level is one way to do it.
Absolutely. That's really great insight, and those frustrations around the science is there. It's just about getting the actions through policy, but at least the people, which I'm sure many people here today are part of groups or a part of the citizen science, which is so important. So don't stop doing those things. We just need to work a bit harder with the policy and the governments and politicians.
Oh,
now, this hasn't happened before, but we've actually got a question from one of our panelists for another one. So Nicola, I might have you just ask the question for David, which is really fantastic to see. So David, you've inspired all of us today, including the other panelists. So Nicola, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I guess, well, being a scientist, it sort of comes back to what you were just saying before, but what do you feel is the biggest gap between science and real action? Because, you know, there is a gap between actually creating the policy and, like, is there something that marine scientists can do to maybe shift the argument? Because, I don't know, I feel like money is a good way to do that. Is there anything that you have for that?
Interestingly, we've received nothing through all our 30 years of lobbying. It's all been about the environment not getting some grant. But unfortunately, the opposition often say, oh, we're doing this. They probably attribute their own motivations to us. That is, it's all about the money. And it's of course, it's not at all. There's very little funding at all for marine issues in Australia, especially in New South Wales. And so we're pretty much doing it on our own time, on weekends, for the love of it. And I think people need to realise we're part of the community as well. One thing I'd like to see is, I've mentioned fishing pollution and fishing effects. There are many, many responsible fishers, and these people are at the forefront of observing the ocean. And I think we need to engage more with the 80 or 90% of fishers that are right on board with marine protection and really want to keep this resource for their children and their children's children. And so, you know, I know many of my marine fellows are spearfishers and things like that. And so, you know, this crossover, like the crossover between the fashion industry, sustainability and science, the crossover between fishing and the science of marine management, I think is going to be the one big way to go. Then everyone will be on board.
Absolutely. Thank you for that.
Thank you for that answer, David. Now, there is a question about Seaspiracy coming, but I might just leave that because we've only got time for one more question. I'm sure, you know, people could answer the Seaspiracy question for a whole webinar. So the last question will go to you, Adam, back to inland sea and using seaweed. We've got a question coming about, is there any issues using seaweed fibres in the traditional manufacturing? And does the machinery need to be upgraded? Now, you've talked about using a specific factory that has the ethical standards, but what about the actual machinery itself in producing the clothing?
Yeah, so the material that we use, or we've used in our first t-shirts, is called a sea cell. So that's a SEA and then with a C. ELL, C-cell, and that's been a patented material by a company in Germany, I think. So that is the material that contains the seaweed, which I think is made up of a percentage of sustainable wood pulp and seaweed. So there's just a small percentage that actually ends up in the actual seaweed. But these are one of the first companies that have pioneered really using seaweed in clothing and just paving the way really for other companies to use more seaweed. So that material is then mixed with the cotton. So in terms of it, I think being a material that's used in the machines and actually producing the final t-shirts, it's already a material that can be blended with the cottons and things. But there are other companies, there's a company called Algae Knit in New York who seem to be absolutely smashing it, I think, with seaweed and fashion. And they, from what I know, they're trying to create a polymer replacement for polyester, but I know that they're having difficulties with it making it strong enough. But then that would obviously be spun into like a yarn and then put onto the machines to actually make a material. But it's super early days, but I think it definitely can be done. There needs to be more research and just methods and everything and testing and talking and connecting up with people. So yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Adam, for that. And thank you to all the guests, all the panelists for your answers today. That concludes the Q&A session. That's really insightful questions as well that came through. So thank you to everyone who's been involved in the chat. I'll now pass it back to Ricki to close off today's event.
Thanks, Morgan. Oh my goodness, we could talk for hours. I think there is so much that we've opened up, lots and lots of different areas we can go into to try and do what we need to do with our oceans, and particularly this year is still a bit of a maze everyone's going through. Like for some of you, you know that we're located here in Melbourne and we're in a lockdown still, lockdown 4. So, you know, if the world is a ever-changing dynamic at the moment, and the work that all of you are doing is so incredibly important, as we feel is, you know, with what we're doing with Plastic Oceans Australasia, with trying to just get the momentum going. And I've tried really hard not to say anything about the PPE dynamic issue that we've got, but obviously it's a real problem, and it all relates to clothing and fibres and throwaway mentality and everything that we're doing. So it would be remiss of me not to wrap up today without sharing with you what Plastic Oceans Australasia's got next in stall. So we actually are going to give you something to look forward to, which is in September. Again, to be positive and moving forward, we're launching our very first annual fundraiser called Picnics Unwrapped. And we're inviting supporters to host their own plastic-free picnic to help raise funds for our education programs, but also with all the advocacy and policy work we do behind the scenes, which I haven't mentioned. There was talk about that in the Q&A, and policy change is very important, and it's a big part of what we do. So the actions along with policy change are the two things that will make that change for us. Just going back to the picnic, the challenge with the picnic, of course, is to get people to wrap their delicious hampers and everything that they're doing with no plastic. And I'm actually really excited because I've left a little tip at the end, which is to spearhead this event. We're very pleased to announce that Nicola is going to be our first Picnic Unwrapped ambassador. So thank you so much for taking that up to help the charge with that work. And there'll be more on that on Facebook. So if any of you would like to like us on Facebook and join our email list, we'll send out more about that, of course, in the near future. Also, we've been running during lockdown, which started last year, our series called No Time to Waste. So if any of you out there are webinar junkies, and there's lots of people that are still, which is really great, we are starting round 3 of our series on June 25th. And we've got another lineup of great speakers from around the world. So I hope if any of you are interested, please feel free to jump on and register for that. And of course, if you're interested to find out more about our programs and what we're doing and with all of our work, and I'd love to just encapsulate all of the 3 panelists today, put all of our heads together and all raise funds for everything that we're doing in one big, one big pond. We can put everything into there, and we would have obviously a much greater outcome if we all were able to work together, which I believe the world is getting a smaller place. So I would like to let you know you can contact us on info@plasticoceans.org. It'll be in the chat line. Thank you again to all our special guests and to everybody for joining us. I hope you all have a fabulous day what's left for World Oceans Day. And Adam, I hope you get a good sleep when you finally get to bed. So thank you again, and look forward to chatting with everybody again really soon. So thanks so much, and we'll see you in the near future. Ciao.